Okay, so welcome, welcome, welcome. Well, we will go ahead and get started so that we respect everybody's time. And I know that Tamala is on her way back to the office, but I hope she's able to see and at least hear. And we will record these meetings and then we'll post them online. And then if anybody needs to go back and hear or see anything, then they can. So first of all, thank you. Thank you all for your willingness to participate in this. I know every one of you are super busy and have lots of things going on and families to take care of and all the other things that make life busy outside of work. So I appreciate your time and your commitment. I want to start really today by introductions. I think most everybody knows everybody, but I want to make sure that we're all introduced so that we don't have anybody that doesn't know somebody there. So I'll start, and I'm Lisa, and work for the Authorizer Board. So I have Rachel. I have you next on the agenda.
All right, I'm Rachel Cantor. I'm the Executive Director of Mississippi First.
Okay, Elise.
Hi, I'm Elise Marcelino. I'm the Vice President for Education at Empower Mississippi.
Jean.
Hi, I'm Jean Cook. I'm a Charter Board member.
Christy.
Hi, I'm Christy Hendricks. I'm the Executive Director of Midtown Partners, and we officially hold the charter for Midtown Public.
Thank you. Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Poulos. I am the Chief Operating Officer for Republic Schools, which includes Smilo Collegiate, Smilo Prep, and Reimagine Prep.
Thank you. Tamala.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Tamala Boyd-Shaw, the founder, executive director of Mississippi Delta Academies, LaFleur Legacy Academy.
Okay, all right. Avery.
I'm Avery Lee. I'm the attorney for the Mississippi Charter School Authorizer Board. I'm with the Attorney General's office, and I'm here kind of just as support.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So with that, after the introductions, I think we're just going to hop right into the presentation. And I asked Avery if she would kind of put together a Schoolhouse Rocks Legal 101 prior to jumping into the work so that everybody would be kind of on the same page with an understanding of how legislation works, where we go from here, what the purpose of the task force is, and how we're gonna roll throughout this task force process. So Avery, with that in mind, if you would.
Sure. Okay. Well, y'all know who I am, so we can move forward on the next slide. I did want to take the opportunity just to make sure all of you, I know you all know that Lynn Fitch is the new Attorney General, but I just wanted you to be able to see a little bit of her background. She is my boss. So I just wanted to make sure that y'all knew a little bit about her and what she does. Y'all all know she's the Chief Legal Officer and Advisor for the state. She handles all the criminal and civil matters for all of our state agencies. You know, her responsibilities to represent public officials and the governmental agencies and to issue legal opinions to interpret state law, which is important. In fact, the Charter School Authorizer Board just requested an opinion and we're waiting on it to be issued from my office.
Avery, do you want to talk a little bit about that right now so that everybody will know where we are with our request? Because I'm not sure everybody knows that we ask for an opinion.
Right. So there were some issues about the 3% that the charter schools, well, that the board invoices to the charter schools and that they are to pay to the charter schools for the operation and maintenance and management of the charter schools. There was a question, I think, that Peer raised as to what the amount should be.
It started from me.
Okay. Do you want to do some background that I can tell you from the AG's perspective forward?
Yep. Sure. So actually it started with Christy, to be honest. So we were working back and forth with the 3% request and the invoice, and we were looking at all of the accrual reports that come out, and they come out to the schools, and we were looking at the definitions and everything, and there are pieces and parts of the MAEP funding. There's the EEF component. There's the EEF component for teachers, which is separate from the Fund 3150, which is the overall MAP. So we got to looking at it. It was COVID. There were some opportunities, I think, that if we could reduce what the schools were having to pay to us this year, we wanted to be able to take advantage of that. So had a lot of conversation back and forth with Peer at that time, and then Peer didn't really know. And I think MDE didn't really know. Did we have to charge the schools for the per capita? Did we have to charge them for that additional EEF component that comes through MAEP? And so I just took a risk this year and did not charge that. I just charged against that overall MAEP amount that's at the top of the accrual page. And so it left off two pieces that are actually funded through MAEP. So having said all that, we needed to get an opinion. And so we did, and we requested that opinion, and then you can take it from here. Amy.
Well, and it's still in that process. So I helped draft the opinion request and kind of put forward the factual information behind why Dr. K thought that maybe they could not charge as much as they had in the past, and put forward a question to them as to, you know, whether they had to pay just a total 3% of the amount that is distributed to them from MDE, or could it be less?
Mm-hmm.
So that has been working itself through the process. BB Gerard is the attorney who's in the opinions division who's drafting that. But after she finalizes her draft, which she has done a final draft, it has to go through the opinions committee. So many other eyes in the office will look at that and research the law behind her opinion draft to see if they agree with it or not. So it certainly could come out different from the way BB submitted it. So we really don't know how they're going to opine at this point. I have requested that they move it to the front if possible and expedite it. So we'll see if that is able to be accomplished or not, but we certainly hope so.
Yeah.
And that we'll be able to get an opinion out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And I'll, be able to keep all of you posted once that's issued.
Yeah. It'll be great for the schools if we can avoid having to charge you guys for those other components and just hit that.
Right. That's the hope.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway.
And this would be for this year and future years, or just this year?
I did it for this year, Elise, and charged them just that one component. Let me see if I've got my EEF stuff right here. I don't have it right here, but I was hoping to go for future years, but who knows how they'll opine and what they'll think about it, and what the year will think about it in their final report. So.
And once the opinion is issued, it is prospective too. So if it says the law states you only charge 3% of this amount, then that's what the charter school board would have to do this year and moving forward. And if they say, oh no, you have to charge the whole amount, then that would be what the board would have to do. They would need to follow the advice of the Attorney General.
Unless there's a legislative change.
Unless there's a legislative change, which is why we're all here today. But let's go ahead and move forward. I think y'all have been able to see that slide, and so we can go ahead and start talking about the Mississippi Charter Schools Act. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little background. I'm sure most of you know this, but in April of 2013, that is when the Governor, Phil Bryant, signed the Mississippi Charter Schools Act into law. It did not become effective until July the 1st of that year, but at that point, the board was put into place and they started beginning the process of getting charter schools in our state. For those of you who ever want to look at the act and don't have access or don't have it, it can be found in the Mississippi Code, annotated. You can see that whole bookcase is the code, but it's actually in Title 37, Chapter 28, and it includes sections 1 through 61. And it's cited, I put this down in case you ever needed to do a search. You can go to the Secretary of State's website and they have the entire Mississippi Code available online. And you can put in these numbers 37-21-1 or any other of those sections, and they're all odd. So it's 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, all the way through 61. And then you'll be able to look at each of those provisions and the different topics that they cover. And just so you know, when it says ETSEQ, I just didn't want to assume you all knew that, but that just means and the following. So anytime you see that referenced in law, that means any other provisions following section 1 until the end of that chapter. So that would be 1 through 61. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so why should we be doing a task force? I just thought we'd kind of review this. I mean, obviously, we're at the point of finishing first renewal process with the charter schools. So y'all are 5 years into operations at this point. It's my understanding that the board has recognized that it's time to really look at the places in the act to see if there can be some improvements made, or there's some things that need to be eliminated that really don't need to be in there anymore. If a decision is made to seek amendments by the legislative task force to certain provisions of the act, it's going to require that the statute that you're wanting to change be opened up by the legislature to make these changes to the statutes. Next slide. Back one. All right, so the purpose of the legislative task force is to examine the pre-selected sections of the Mississippi Code annotated, that would be sections 1 through 61, and the goals of this task force are to consider what legislative matters y'all might want to bring before the 2021 legislative session. We're hopefully going to review the code sections that are identified by you, see what changes need to be made, and if appropriate and you feel that it's necessary, we're going to recommend that amendments be made for a legislative action during the next session. We also want to review recent student enrollment task force recommendations that were given I think that was 2 weeks ago, that are related to section 372823. There was much discussion over that provision. And then draft and present language for any technical amendments that we might have. Next slide. So I thought that's a lot of terminology. So I wanted to go over these terms. I've been saying amendment and technical amendments and opening the code. And you may all know exactly what that is, but just in case, I wanted to make sure you understood the difference between an amendment and a technical amendment. And I'm going to look off to the sides for the notes that I made. An amendment is an addition or an alteration that's made to a statute and also commonly made to bills in the course of their passage through the legislature. So it's an alteration in the law that's already existing, but it does leave some part of the original standing. So if it was a completely different, it wouldn't be an amendment, it would be a completely new law. So when it's an amendment, you have to have something original from the original statute still remaining. A technical amendment means a proposed amendment which is not material to the existing law or is required to it is required to correct a manifest error in an existing statute. An example of this would be to renumber paragraphs of a section of the law. I mean, there are different technical amendments, but let's say they added something and they noticed that the paragraphs were misnumbered, then they can bring forward a technical amendment just to correct that mistake. Or to correct something in the language of the statute, but it would not materially change the intent or the purpose of the statute. So when we talk about opening the code, that means that when a bill is submitted to the legislature, that any statutes that will be changed in any way as a result of the bill passing will be opened up so that those changes can be made and voted on by both chambers of the legislature. Once the statute is opened up, as they say, any amendment can be made to that statute, including those not requested by the legislators that actually submitted the bill to the different committees. The fourth term I thought would be important for you to know is a repealer. There's several different types of repealers. A repealer is where a previously existing law is abrogated or it's annulled by the enactment of a subsequent statute which declares that the former law shall be revoked. So it's often called an express repealer. This provision is used when the law is needed only for a certain period of time or to force the legislature to revisit the issue of that or the law in order for that statute to continue to be law. And that is what they did originally with the Charter Schools Act. They put a repealer in place saying that it would be repealed in 2020. And what that did was force the legislature to come back, look at those statutes prior to the repealer date to see if any changes needed to be made. Do they still want to move forward with this? And so they did do that, but that was the type of repealer that was included in the act affecting charter schools. There's also an extended repealer, and that just lengthens out the time that was previously fixed to repeal a statute. So instead of getting rid of the repealer or looking at it, they just extend it. So they're not ready to do any changes, or they might make some technical amendments, but they do want to keep the repealer in place to come back again. So they just extend that date that the statute would be repealed. The last term is the reverse repealer, and this one's interesting. That sets the revocation of the law the day before the law is to be enacted. So in essence, that's a way to kill the bill before it ever becomes law. And this is most often inserted in a bill to ensure that it cannot become law without the legislation being returned to the original chamber for additional revisions. So if there's some members of a different committee or on the other side of the chamber that want some changes, then they'll put in this reverse repealer. And if they want it to get out, they're going to have to go back, and it's a way of forcing them to look at some other amendments that they might want to be in that law. All right, next slide. I wanted to go over a few, I'm gonna move mine so I can see, a few examples of some of the former amendments that have happened with this act. These are not all of them, but these are certainly important ones that happened. So in 2014, 3728.7 was amended, and this was a good move, to remove the requirement that the executive director also be general counsel for the board. So that removed the requirement that the executive director had to be an attorney. And thankfully they did that, because that's how we got Dr. K with us today, and we're moving forward in such a positive way now. In 2015 and again in 2016, section 3728.55 was amended to change the method of determining the amount the Department of Education was to pay charter schools. In 2016, 3728.23 was amended to open charter schools to include any child residing in geographical boundaries of a school district with the C, D, or F rating. We all know how important that was, because finally children could actually go to a charter school that wasn't within their geographical boundary if the schools that were in their boundary were poor performing. This 2016 amendment also required charter schools to give an enrollment preference to underserved children to ensure that they were meeting the required underserved student composition. So that language was added that year as well. And one of the most important amendments was again in 2016, and we were so pleased when this happened. The legislature repealed section 3728.63, which was a provision that would have the entire act repealed on July 1st of 2020. So 3728.63 was the repealer statute for this act, and they repealed the repealer. So there's no requirement now to go back and revisit unless the legislature tacks that on. If these statutes are opened up, then at that point they can, this year, let's say in the 2021 session, they can add a repealer back in and require that the legislature come back and look at it again in the future. All right, next slide. So you may already know this. This is the little, I'm just a bill, but I thought it would be important to cover just quickly. I know you all know that when a proposed law is a bill, okay? So and you introduce it into the legislature, it can be introduced into either chamber. After it's introduced, it has to be referred to one or more standing committees, and those committees determine whether the bill should move forward as it was proposed, or they can also propose other amendments or additional amendments, or change the language of the bill that's been proposed. If it does pass through the committee phase, then it's going to return to the chamber in which it was introduced. This chamber will discuss the bill, consider any amendments suggested by a committee or by a member of the chamber, and once it's been finalized, then the original chamber will vote on whether to pass it. If it's passed, then it has to go through the whole same process in the other chamber. Sometimes the second chamber will amend the bill again and pass a different version of the one that was put forward, let's say in the House. The Senate could have a completely different bill that comes out in the language is not similar to the one that was proposed and gone through the House. The bill will not reach the next stage unless the differences between the versions can be resolved, and each chamber must pass identical versions of the bill. Now, if that happens, then it will at that point go to the governor for signature and hopefully become a law. Or if he doesn't act on it, it still becomes a law. The only way it would not is if he actually vetoed it. All right, next slide. So why is this important? It's important for two reasons. There are intended consequences that are that we want to accomplish, and that's that any recommendations that y'all make as a legislative task force, that those be included in the bill, that be submitted to the legislature, and then it comes out of the legislature exactly the way you put it forward, and then it will be law. And you hope that both chambers vote on it and pass it, and it goes to the governor and he signs it. But something to consider are the unintended consequences that can happen if we move forward and do propose a bill to one or both chambers. It could be the opposite, and one being that the bill doesn't even make it to a floor vote, and it doesn't pass, and no action is taken. But the even more important unintended consequence is that the bill works its way through one or both chambers, and significant changes are made to the bill, and amendments are made, and it could be by a non-supporter, even not someone that's just trying to make it better, but someone maybe who opposes charter schools or wants to possibly have these changes could have a more negative impact on funding for the charter schools. If we look at that 3% or the way that y'all are funded, it could add more requirements, so it could add to the school's accountability, or it could also reduce the amount of autonomy that the charter schools have, possibly. But so those are just things to consider when the task force makes its decision, along with the help of the Charter School Authorizer Board and staff, as to whether or not you really want to open up any of these statutes and submit a bill to the legislature. That's all I've got.
Thank you. Do y'all have any questions for Avery or clarifications or anything around any of the slides? Anybody? Okay, then we will move on if we don't have any questions. Rachel, did you have anything you want to add? Was there anything that, since you were so involved on the front end, do you have anything you want to add to, or that we might have missed that was important?
No, if anybody's interested in the history of the legislation, we have multiple documents up on our website about the original bill, the 2014 amendment, the 2015 amendments, the 2016 amendments, walking through each of those and why they came about, if anybody wants any more detail.
Okay, all righty. Thank you for that. Okay, then we will move in. Avery, thank you again for putting that together. I really do appreciate that. I think it helps us kind of set the stage for what we need to do next with the legislative task force. So when you guys got the letter and you agreed to serve on the task force, one of the things that we asked you to do after you agreed to serve was to complete a survey, understanding that we do not have time to go through every single section of our chapter and code prior to the legislative session kicking off in January. And so we ask you to rank order those sections of the code that are most important to you and where you felt like might need some attention one way or the other. So we did that through SurveyMonkey, and the next slide that you're going to see here are the results of that survey. So can you make that just a little bit bigger, Jordan? Thank you. Thank you. So you can see, and I'm going to flip over to one of my notes here, you can see how they came out. So actually 37, 28, 23 was the #1 area of, I won't say concern, but the area of importance for everybody that submitted their responses to the survey. And that particular code section is related to school enrollment, the school lottery, and the capacity to enroll all students. It impacts, and y'all don't have to take notes. I'm gonna give you a slide or a document that has all this on here. But it impacts your operators, all the schools, it impacts everybody, right? So that was the number one. Number two was 372821, which was is the initial charter term and the charter contract. So that came in at number two. Let me just say this and not tell y'all a story. I think we had a tie on number two. I believe 21. Tell me if I'm wrong, Jordan. But did we have a tie between 21 and 45?
That's correct.
Okay, 21 and 45, we did have a tie. They both came in with the same number in order of importance. And that one is applicability of statutes, rules, regulations, policies, procedures, etc., that non-charter public schools are subject to with relation to other laws. That, of course, impacts all of our charter schools, and the one prior to that impacts applicants as well. The next one in order of importance came in at 372843, and that is prohibition against discrimination, prohibition against charging tuition, the transportation plan, and virtual courses. 372841 came in next, and that was charter school powers. So you can look at the visual there and see where everything fell, and we can give you a copy of this if you'd like to have one. 372847, at the end of the survey, you were given an opportunity to add anything that might be important to you that wasn't listed on that initial list of statutes and code statutes there. And two of the responses came up with 372847, which is the qualifications of charter school employees and the applicability of EEPL, or the Education Employment Procedures Law. So we added that to our to-do list so that we could at least take a look at it, since two of you responded that that was an important area to take a peek at. All right, questions about that? All righty. So the next slide that you see, Jordan, if you can make that just a little bit bigger too, because I'm old and I can't see. Thank you. You can see this document. When you get a copy of this document, you'll be able to link in to the survey results, which is what I just shared with you. And on the left-hand side of this document, you're going to see the code section for review, and those are in the order of importance that they came out in terms of the survey. So going back to what I just shared, 372823 was number one, 372821 was number two, tied with number 45, and so forth. On the next column there, you'll see the primary impact. And all of these primarily impact the operators, the school level, with the exception of 21, which also impacts applicants. Then what we did, we asked Rachel and we asked Elise if they would be kind enough to support us in a team lead role. Rachel, we didn't get a final answer for you, so we put you down anyway. So if that's okay, we have you as a team lead.
Yes, the only thing that I had said to Jordan was I just wanted to make sure what the time commitment was.
Yeah. So I think having a team, we'll be able to work through this, and we can help however you need us to as well. If it's, doing some research or whatever you need us to, we're happy to do that. So I appreciate you and Elise both being willing to take the lead on this. So what we did, we divided it really pretty evenly so that everybody will have 3 sections to look at. And you can see there in that column, 372823 will be Rachel, and on your team you'll have Jean and Christy. And 372821, Katie and Tamala, you'll be on Elisa's team. And then you can see the rest of those throughout there on that column, so you know which sections you'll be responsible for reviewing. I want to point out on the far right-hand side on the number 1, 372823, the Student Enrollment Task Force did make a recommendation related to that particular statute, but their recommendation was not to open it up. Their final recommendation was that they would look at these 4 different components. You can pull that up, Jordan. Thank you. 4 different areas of recommendation that we needed to consider. Some impact the framework, some impact the contract. So when you guys are reviewing that section, if you'll go back and look at what the Student Enrollment Task Force recommendations were, that'll give you some backstory and some guidance there on how you may want to go forth with your analysis of that statute and then your recommendations in the final phase. Okay, questions about that? Anybody have a question? Okay. So the next thing we want to look at is how this all going to play out.
Sorry, Lisa, I didn't click fast enough. Can you make sure that we have these Student Enrollment Task Force recommendations, as well as any notes that explain any of these things from that task force, because I think that's one of ours.
It is, and yes, we can. They shared Google Docs throughout that task force, so there's a couple of PowerPoint presentations. In fact, Christy was on one of those committees, and so she led one of those charges with DeArchie. Wasn't it with DeArchie you led one of the charges? So yeah, we can get you all that information, and so you'll have enough history to go by. Any other questions there? All right, so this is how I think this will make sense for us because our time is limited. And so I'm hopeful this will work really well. But in terms of considering your particular code section, you can do these however you really choose, but this will give you a good outline. So if you want to, Elise, Rachel, if you want to assign independent areas for your team members to look at, if you want to do it collectively and set aside a time to do it collectively and review each section, if you will unpack that language, then to determine what changes, if any, need to be made, right? Do we want to take a risk? Do we want to open the code section? Or do we want to do the same thing we did with the Student Enrollment Task Force and address it in different ways? Do we want to take a peek at it and then say, this might be kind of tricky. Perhaps we should address it through the framework, or maybe we need to address it through the contract, or another option as opposed to going into the code section. But as you look at that section and determine whether or not any changes need to be made, you can go ahead and redline those. You can go ahead and delete sections if you want to. You can spell out your recommendations for any technical amendments if they're needed, or you can just make a note, we're not going to recommend any change to this particular section. I do want you to solicit input from the charter leaders that are not on the task force and any external stakeholders as well. So other stakeholders in our charter world that might have an influence or an opinion or an idea related to that section, then go ahead and seek some input from them. And then just be ready to present your recommendations and the rationale for those decisions during your time of reporting out. And again, because we have a limited amount of time, Rachel, your team will be reporting out in November, and then Elise, yours will be in December. And then we will come together collectively in January, review everybody's recommendations, and we'll work by consensus. If we don't need to take a vote, we'll just roll with consensus. If we need to take a vote, we certainly can. But that's kind of a high-level overview of what my thoughts are on how we need to proceed. I am open to suggestions, ideas, thoughts on a better way to make this work for us. And ready to listen to whatever thoughts you guys have or recommendations you might want to share. Y'all are quiet.
I have a question, and it may be because I'm new, but for these code sections, are there particular ones that give you heartburn or that are problematic, or like, I don't feel like I have enough background on what we might want to change?
the one that gives me the most heartburn is not on here, and that would be the one that requires a peer report every year.
Okay.
And that was written in, I guess, because we were a new agency, and it was, so every single year we have to do the peer report, which is a laborious task, as you well know. So, and we just finished up for this year. But anyway, that was the one that gives me the most heartburn. There are some in here that give heartburn to the schools. One is the enrollment piece, which is why we had the enrollment task force as well. Let me look back at these code sections again that I know were a little bit tricky. I think the applicability of statutes and what charter schools are responsible for versus what they're not responsible for when you're comparing to a traditional school versus a charter school. I think that one sometimes gives folks some heartburn. I don't really see anything else that pops up to me. What about you guys? Christy, Tamala?
Yeah, Lisa, I had a question how the first grouping came about. So is that just conversations over time, or because some of them are obvious to me, like I have a thought, but when I was trying to rank them, there was a couple that I just wasn't quite sure. So
yeah. I think Jordan, I don't know if you can pull up that original document or not when we first started looking at it. To answer your question, what I did, I went through the whole section, right? I went through all of the code sections, and I tried to find out what is it that impacts the schools directly? What impacts us that doesn't impact you? So, for example, the 3% would certainly impact you, but we already have an AG opinion that we're working on with that one. So there really wasn't, and peer always analyzes that one. So there really wasn't a reason for us to spend time on that particular issue. So I tried to just do it logically and go through and say, okay, this impacts like definitions, for example, 3721-1, I believe, or whatever it is. Yeah, it does, or 5 maybe, does definitions. Yeah, so 5, there's no reason we're gonna change the definitions of an applicant or an authorizer or a contract or things like that. 3728-7, the jurisdiction, it just tells what we are and who we are. So I didn't feel like that was something that the task force really needed to take a look at. There's sections that just impact us and sections that impact y'all. So, and that's why we gave you an opportunity to add anything in that you felt like that wasn't addressed on the initial list. Does that answer your question, Christy?
yeah, it did. And with that initial list, like there wasn't a concern that was raised necessarily with all of those, though that was just kind of the starting list.
That's right. That's exactly right. No one has brought any of these code sections to my attention outside of the student enrollment. So those were the only ones that, and of course the contract we worked on last year. So that one bubbled up to the top for my, attention simply because we had worked on that last year. Outside of that, really there's not anything else, unless somebody has anything else they want to share that's bubbled up that we might not have known about.
Background checks.
Oh, well, yeah, Avery. The background checks, that really impacts us more than y'all, because what we tried to do is get it back into your wheelhouse and us not have to be responsible for it. But Jordan's done such a great job of having a process now. It seems to be flowing pretty well. So if we do take anything, before the legislature and ask for any kind of amendment, that will be one that we address, so that we can make sure that you guys are responsible for the background checks of your employees and we're not doing anything on our end for your folks.
Lisa, I have a question about,
Sure.
There was a bill last year in the legislature that Lydia Chaffinall filed. It didn't go anywhere, but it was, my understanding, it was based on some recommendations that peer had in the peer report from the prior year, and it dealt with the charter board, the 3%, and I think there was like a technical change. They wanted to how local funding was calculated.
Yes.
That, I don't know that I see any of those issues within the scope of this. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Yes, I'm grateful it didn't go anywhere, number one. And number two, with the 3% piece, Rachel, we are working, I'm sorry, I'll have to call my dad back. We are working with Peer and with the AG and trying to get some of that cleaned up so that charter schools don't have to, I hope they don't have to pay as much, number one, but they need to be able to get their allocations based on the way the law reads now and not in a different way. Does that answer your question?
Well, I was just curious about whether or not the other, in addition to the 3%, there were other issues that were in that bill. And I was curious whether or not those other issues were issues that you wanted to review.
Are you
One
talking
of them,
about the funding?
yeah, there was the funding piece that Peer has made this point possibly a couple of times in a couple of peer review. There is an error in how the local funding is calculated. If you, there's an error with a denominator.
Yes.
And there's also, and then Peer had sort of a weird way they wanted to reshuffle the board, which that didn't make a lot of sense because the board was already staggered, and it seemed as if that bill was saying the board wasn't staggered. It was very odd.
Here's what they were trying to do with that one. Because it's going to come up again. I know it will, because our appointments they're supposed to be staggered. But the first appointment is for 4 years, and the second appointment is for 3 years. If you reappoint that board member, like if Tommy Carden, let's say, was appointed for 4 years and his second appointment was for 3 years, and that's a governor appointment, right? So what happened is, I think some of the people who were supposed to be appointed for 3 years got another 4-year appointment. And so they're just trying to get it all cleaned up.
Yeah, it appears that the way that we wrote it, the way that Gray meant for it to be read, was that in order to establish staggered terms, the gubernatorial appointments got 4-year terms the first time only. And then thereafter, every single member should have gotten a 3-year term. And it was an error within Bryant's office in how they submitted those reappointments to the Secretary of State to make it appear as if they were that the governor always gets a 4-year term for the first term of a new board member. And, I don't know if that's worth a clarification or not within the bill, but it certainly has ramifications for what you're facing now with multiple board members rolling off the same time.
Right. I think, I feel like Peer, we've had lots of discussions, and the Peer report is in a draft form. It's not public yet, obviously, so I can't give you too much detail on it, but I can tell you that the things that we're discussing, Peer, we've discussed with Peer. I've discussed with them. So about funding, about the denominator, about the 3%, and about the appointments. So once it's made public in 6 weeks or whatever it ends up being, then we can talk some more about it. And maybe at that point, once it's public, we can bring it back to the task force if we need to and look at some ways to address anything that we need to. Will that work?
All right.
That will work then, to address it that way, you think?
Well, I guess it depends on whether or not I'm less concerned about whether Peer is mad about something and more concerned about whether or not something is correct.
Right.
And so I think the issue is just, is Peer planning on doing a separate bill from whatever we come up with, or will there be some sort of marriage between, if Peer, because, Peer often pushes legislation through members of the Peer committee in the legislature. And it would just be I would think, a bad situation if we had a Peer bill and then we also had a separate bill.
I agree. And that's what happened with Lydia last year. That's because she's on the committee, and that's why she ended up dropping that bill. I don't know. let me just think about that a little bit and how we might want to deal with it.
Okay.
Lisa,
Okay.
could I just clarify really quickly? So the code sections that are here are a result of the survey results, and that's everyone who is in this group. So nothing's been solicited from other school leaders that aren't in this group.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And that's why
Okay.
on that little guidance of considerations for how you guys attack this, if you will be sure and reach out to the counterparts and to others who have an interest in our work. Yeah, that's correct. Okay, other questions? Tamala, you're quiet.
First of all, I'll say that I am, because policy and legalese and all of that is certainly not my strong suit. So I have to learn to be quiet and listen and learn when the time calls for it. And that is one of these times. But I am definitely eager to dig into these code sections for review. And I'm glad that we have team leads. Hey, Elise. Hey, Rachel. Both of whom I've worked with and been in close contact with over the course of all of this work. So I know they're very capable of doing this. So
Absolutely.
that's why. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And I am very, very thankful for both of you, because I do know that you guys both have expertise in this work and have experience, and I have all the confidence in the world that you can lead your team through where we need to get to. And I appreciate your willingness to serve. Other questions, comments? Y'all, this is our first time to have this. So we can, we have a kind of a skeleton outline, and we can put some more meat on the bones if we need to. We can address things if they come up, questions that come up as you work through your sections in particular. This can be a working group. I mean, it doesn't have to be rigid. And so I want us to get to where we need to be without causing angst or causing any challenges or unintended consequences that we talked about earlier. That's not our goal or our intent. Our goal is to strengthen the law, strengthen the support we can provide to the schools where we can. And if we can avoid any unintended consequences, we'll want to address that through framework or contract, and where we can and get support. That's the other piece, is getting some support in the legislature for what we do, then we can do it that way. So nothing's set in stone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. Well, if nobody has any more questions, I think we're just a few minutes ahead of time. So I appreciate your willingness and all of your time. And I look forward to hearing from Team Rachel in November to hear what you guys unpack and what you have to share in terms of recommendations. So y'all don't hesitate to reach out. I want to say thanks to Katie, y'all. She's just not feeling very well right now. But she's here, she's listening, and we all want to wish her well and hope she feels better soon. So y'all take care, have a good afternoon, and let me know if you need anything.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.